Chapter 3, the chemical building blocks of life. Carbon is the basis for all life on Earth. And when I say that, I mean that it creates the framework of all the materials that the cell needs for processes, all the structures that it needs within the cell to make the cell itself work. Carbon bonds primarily to hydrogen, but nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur are often present. There are other atoms that combine with carbon in these structures, but not as often. Carbon has the unique ability of being able to form 4 covalent bonds, as well as being able to bond with itself. Gas atoms are the only ones that can actually do this. This makes carbon unique. The ability to create 4 covalent bonds and to bond with itself allows carbon an amazing possibility of molecules for it to make. It seems to be able to make compounds that are unlimited in length and in a variety of shapes. Most compounds are linear, but carbon can make linear molecules, straight chains. It can also make branch chains, circles, balls, tubes, and coils. Each shape has its own physical and chemical properties. Combine unlimited length, 6 different shapes, variety of physical and chemical properties, and you have an endless possibility for compounds. As I said, most of the time hydrogen bonds to carbon. When it does, it creates a carbon-hydrogen framework, and it is non-polar. Non-polar because the electronegativities between the hydrogen and the carbon are almost the same. Once the framework is made, the polar molecules attach to it, and these polar molecules are called functional groups. Each functional group has its own set of properties. Our first group is the hydroxyl group, OH. It's the picture on the left. The capital R represents the carbon-hydrogen framework. Hydroxyl groups create alcohols. The middle group is the amino group. It will create amino acids. Amino acids create proteins. And then the phosphate group at the end, which is phosphorus with 4 oxygens double bonded to it. The R would be over here. A macromolecule is a series of smaller subunits called monomers. Each monomer includes a carbon-hydrogen framework, a functional group. You put a bunch of monomers together and you get a polymer. A bunch of polymers together will create a cellular structure, a cytoskeleton, or a chromosome. Those polymers are also called macromolecules. Our first macromolecule are the carbs. This is the sugars that the body uses. They come in 3 forms: mono, di, and polysaccharides. Saccharide means sugar. So the monosaccharides, the simple sugars, are single molecule saccharides. The most important of this group are the 5 and the 6 carbon sugars. If you look at the 5 carbon picture on the left, there's a carbon at each point where the lines intersect. A ribose sugar is the backbone sugar for RNA. The deoxyribose sugar is the backbone for DNA. The 6 carbon sugar on the right is glucose. This is the energy molecule for the body. Plants create glucose during photosynthesis. Plants and animals break glucose down for the energy within it and create the energy necessary during cellular respiration. Disaccharides are 2 monosaccharides attached together. They are used to transport glucose. Glucose will break down before it gets to its desired location. So it is attached to a second monosaccharide. The body can't break down disaccharides, so it allows that sugar to be located where it's actually needed before it breaks down. The most common of the disaccharides are sucrose, which is on the left, lactose, which is on the right. Sucrose is called table sugar. You find it in sugar cane and sugar beets. An enzyme will break that bond between the glucose and the fructose, and then a second enzyme will break the glucose down for energy. Lactose is galactose bonded to glucose. Again, an enzyme will break the two apart, and then a second enzyme will produce the energy from the glucose. Lactose is found in mother's milk, so it's called a milk sugar. If you don't have the enzyme necessary to break galactose from glucose, you are called lactose intolerant. The polysaccharides are long chains of monosaccharides attached together. Starch is long-term storage of energy in plants. Starches are insoluble in water and must be broken down into individual pieces of glucose for energy. That's my picture of the potato. That's the starch. Cellulose is used for cellular structures. It creates the cell walls within the plants and creates the structures that plants need to be able to stand upright. In celery, it's those long stringy things that get caught in your teeth when you eat them. Chitin is the shell in a bug and the shell of the crustaceans, the lobsters, the shrimps, the crabs. In this case, it's a polysaccharide attached to a protein that creates this compound. The nucleic acids provide the information that the cell needs to carry out its functions. The nucleic acids are larger molecules composed of small monomers called nucleotides. A nucleotide is a monosaccharide, a phosphate, and a nitrogen base. Nucleic acid comes in two forms: deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, which is the genetic information that your body needs to create who you are, how you behave, what your abilities are. RNA is the workhorse, ribonucleic acid. It creates the amino acids, which will become the proteins, which will allow the body and the cells to carry out the necessary functions. We will talk about DNA and RNA when we get to chapter 14 and chapter 15. Nucleotides also create ATP, which is the energy of the cell, NAD and FAD molecules. These are electron carriers. They are also used to create energy. We will talk about ATP, NAD, and FAD when we talk about photosynthesis and respiration. That would be chapter 7, 8. Proteins are our next macromolecule. There are 7 categories of proteins and thousands of proteins within those categories. Our first are the enzymes. Enzymes carry out catalysis, which is to increase or decrease the rate of a chemical reaction. For example, if you eat your lunch and it goes to your stomach, hydrochloric acid is released. That hydrochloric acid begins to break down the food. It's a slow process if you just use the acid. But hydrochloric acid also stimulates the release of the enzyme pepsin, and pepsin causes the food to break down faster. That's what allows us to get immediate energy from the food we consume. Enzymes also serve in defense. That's our immune system, the proteins that attack bacteria and viruses in the body. We will talk about the immune system toward the end of the year. Transport proteins move molecules from one place to another in the body. For example, hemoglobin moves oxygen while attached to the blood. Within the cellular membrane, you will find proteins embedded that move food in and wastes out. Support proteins give structures and give shape to the molecules. They provide the structures that make blood clots. They provide the collagen that creates tendons and ligaments. Motion is on a big scale and a small scale. It allows the muscles to move, to contract, and to relax so that you can actually physically move. It also makes the structures within the cell, the cytoskeleton that give it structure, allow them to contract and expand. This is what gives you goosebumps or gives you that feeling that your skin is crawling. Hormones are chemicals that are created in one part of the body that control functions in another part. For example, growth hormones are created in one part of the body and then spread throughout. Storage is our last group. There are certain minerals that the body needs, calcium and iron, that cannot be stored unless a storage protein is attached to them. Our last group are the lipids. This is a very large group, a lot of different characteristics. So the lipids are molecules that are defined as those that are insoluble in water. Lipids have two real purposes. The first is to store energy. In plants, those are the oils, peanut oil, olive oil. In animals, it's body fat or blubber in the marine animals. Fats are huge, huge molecules. They're generally twice as big as carbs and provide 2.5 times more energy. But that energy cannot be accessed right away. What happens is glucose is made in the body or consumed. If it is not consumed 100%, then it has to be stored. It's changed into a lipid and stored in this large molecule form for later. Lipids also are used to form membranes. In this case, it's a phospholipid membrane. The phosphates are on the outside, the lipids are in the middle. The phosphates are polar, the lipids are nonpolar, and they are used to control what goes into and out of the cell. We'll talk about them when we talk about the cellular membrane in Chapter 5. The last thing I want to talk about is cycling. Carbon cycling is very important because it brings that foundational element into and out of living things. It begins as gaseous carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's brought into the living things through photosynthesis. Plants and photosynthetic bacteria and algae convert CO2 into carbon in the glucose molecule. This is called carbon fixation because the gaseous carbon is turned into a solid. Aquatic plants also use CO2 and they also use bicarbonate, HCO3, to bring carbon into the living cycle. Animals incorporate that carbon when they consume the plants. When plants and animals respire, they breathe out CO2, returning carbon to the atmosphere. When they die, they decay. The CO2 in their cells is released, as well as methane. So again, carbon is returned to the atmosphere. We also return carbon into the atmosphere when we burn fossil fuels. Those carbons are then available to go back into the soil and the cycle is repeated. Nitrogen works in a similar manner, it's just a little bit more complicated. Gaseous nitrogen, N2, is introduced into the living cycle through prokaryotes, single-celled organisms that are living in the soil, or in a symbiotic relationship with peas and beans and other legumes. They turn N2, nitrogen gas, into NH3, ammonia. This is called nitrogen fixation. The ammonia is then converted into nitrate, called nitrification, also by single-celled organisms. The ammonia and the nitrate is consumed by plants for nutrition, and they use that in cellular processes for growth. The nitrogen then is transferred from the plants to the animals when the animals eat the plants. Nitrogen is returned to the atmosphere when ammonia is released into the soil and the water through animal waste. That ammonia is converted back into nitrate and then back into nitrogen by soil bacteria. Ammonia and nitrate are then released back into the air, so again the cycle continues. And that is the end of Chapter 3, Macromolecules.